Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's Legacy Award session. I'm Amy Somerville, this year's chair of the SPSP Legacy Award Program. SPSP's Legacy Award honors luminary figures in social and personality psychology. Although the scientific contributions of the awardees' work is an important consideration in this award, the Legacy Award is unique among SPSP's awards because it also considers the broader contributions the awardee has made to the field through mentorship and leadership, and the ways that all of those contributions continue to shape the future of our field. It is my tremendous honor today to recognize this year's winner, Dr. Claude Steele, on behalf of the SPSP Convention Committee. Dr. Steele has created a substantial legacy through his scholarship, mentorship, and leadership. He is a pioneer in the field of minority student achievement, particularly known for his work on stereotype threat and self-affirmation theories. Indeed, he's been recognized by SPSP as a past winner of both the Campbell Award, recognizing a career of outstanding scholarship, and the Service to the Field Award, recognizing his, quote, extraordinary contributions as a public face of social and personality psychology and as an advocate for our research to the nation and the world, unquote. Dr. Steele also has a tremendous legacy of teaching, leadership, and mentorship. He was recognized with the Dean's Teaching Award at Stanford University, where he also served as the chair of the Department of Psychology, the director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and the Dean of the School of Education, among other positions. He has served as provost of both Columbia University and of UC Berkeley. He has trained students who have become impressive and award-winning scholars in their own right, two of whom will join him in today's session, and has served the field with extensive leadership contributions, including as president of SPSP. Dr. Steele's scientific legacy is more important than ever to our science, to our workplaces and academic communities, and to the global community. Building trust and community among diverse identities seems both more daunting and more critically important than ever in the world today. Today, Dr. Steele will present a brief talk on these challenges and potential strategies to overcome them. Following his remarks, he'll be joined by Dr. Mary Murphy and Dr. Jeff Cohen for an informal panel discussion. If you're watching this during the live stream session, our panelists will be online in the chat room during this presentation and are happy to answer your questions there. Dr. Steele, on behalf of SPSP, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Amy, for that wonderful introduction. I can't tell you how gratifying it is to get this award. I feel like SPSP is my home. I grew up in it. I matured in it. I hope I matured in it. But it's such a central part of my life, and I know so many people, and there's so much history that it's just got to be particularly gratifying award to get. So I thank you for that kind introduction, and I thank your committee or whoever is responsible for this. I want to extend my deepest appreciation for it. It's a great pleasure. I wish other people there are other people who I'd love to have shared this with who I can't, but I hope some of you will know what I mean. But I'm deeply gratified by this. Today I want to talk about a question that has sort of preoccupied me in recent years. It comes both from my research around stereotype threat and the like, and also my experience as a university administrator. It's a practical question. It's a question I would like social psychology, I feel, to pay a little more attention to, and that is how do you achieve a successfully diverse community? Within an institution, within a classroom, within a corporation, how do you make it work? And by that, I've been relying on the sort of thumbnail definition of working as being a situation where everyone feels like they can contribute from the standpoint of their backgrounds, their identities, their experiences, and yet they don't feel disadvantaged because of those backgrounds and identities and experiences. That would be maybe a good thumbnail description of inclusion and what it looks like. I think it's a particularly important American question. You know, it is probably the public commitment that our society made to having an integrated society goes back really only to the mid-60s. Before that, we did live under what I think is fair to say a set of apartheids. And it was that is a chief fruit of the civil rights movement that led us to this commitment. So it's really a fairly brief time that our institutions, having originated and evolved in an era before we had that commitment, it's only a brief time that we've asked them to adapt to this challenge, to adapt to this public commitment. So I think that's part of what I want to address today. I want to do two things. One is to offer an analysis of what I think from a social psychological standpoint, the challenge of diversity is, and there I will rely on all of our research. And then I want to propose some principles of remedy that maybe haven't been as obvious as possible, as they might be, and to sort of end on a note of hope. The first part will be a little dark because it does go a bit into the structure and nature of American society, our history. But then I am going to be working toward the light, something hopeful to say here. And I think there are some strategies that we haven't paid as much attention to that offer some real encouragement. The analysis begins with the strategy we've used to integrate our society, which is, roughly speaking, colorblindness, identity blindness. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when that was the hot progressive idea about how we were going to accomplish this business of integrating society that we committed ourselves to after the civil rights movement. It's a basic offer on the table that the enfranchised in society, will promise, trust me, I'll be colorblind, and you, the disenfranchised, your side of the equation is you should assimilate to the mainstream pretty much as fast as you can, and that's how we're going to do it. That's how we've done it with immigrant groups. That's how we're going to do it with other disenfranchised groups. I think that's still the basic offer, American offer on the table. And it has a lot to in its behalf. It really is a standard of fairness for many aspects of life. I suppose most recently we can recognize it as a standard of fairness for policing and for access to healthcare. We want those things to be colorblind and not based on identity. I don't think we're going to jettison this strategy, but I do think it's had some costs, because maybe the last half of the term blindness may be a component of a signal as to some of the things to worry about. And basically what I think it leads us, especially social psychologists who know this terrain, it leads us to maybe underappreciate the significance of people's identities, what they actually mean to us, how they do shape our lives, what conditions of life go with them. We've used identity to organize our society from the very beginning, to stratify it as the old world met the new world. Who was going to be in the social contract, who was going to be out of it, who was going to be enslaved, whose lands would be appropriate. You know, the list goes on of ways in which we stratified our society around identity. And there's certainly serious legacies of that stratification with us today. We have not in any way eliminated them, though we should be proud of having committed, I believe, this commitment, at least the public commitment, to dismantle them. So, I mean, if you think of somebody like, I've been thinking about George Floyd's life. If you think about the circumstances into which he was born, a lot of the things he had to deal with were not because he was an individual, George Floyd, but they were because he was an African-American born in a low-income community where there's going to be much higher unemployment rates, a concatenation of pressures on family life that's going to make it really difficult for people to socialize their kids, prepare them for school. When he goes to school, he's going to go to a school that's really significantly less resourced, with significantly less experienced teachers. He gets in trouble in the criminal justice system. He's going to meet harshness at every turn. He's going to have less access to good health care, to good food. And these are conditions of life that come to him and that he has to contend with because of his identity. So there's the significance of it. And if we're sort of too rigidly colorblind, we're going to miss that. And we're going to miss being able in our institutions and even in our relationships, adapting to that reality. And I'd like to think we're at a moment where adapting to that reality is something we're recognizing the need for something to improve. And this I want to point to. I also think something like Stereotype Threat is a good example of that's the way I've talked about it as a social psychological contingency of identity. Being in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities is relevant, you know you could be judged or treated in terms of it. And if what you're doing is important to you or important to your future, then that pressure can be upsetting and distracting, can interfere with your functioning, can deter you from that whole walk of life where you feel that pressure. And that's something that is tied to you as a condition of life in those situations where those stereotypes are relevant. I won't rehash here the work of looking at stereotype threats effects on performance, standardized test performance, academic performance. I want to just, for the sake of time, get to sort of an example that I think illustrates its significance in our everyday lives. So I ask you to imagine a conversation, a parent-teacher conference between two parents, couple coming in, talking about their 6th grade son. They are African-American, and the teacher they're talking to is white. I want to argue that that's a sort of confrontation of two profound, really profound forms of stereotype threat. And that confrontation is going to make that conversation fraught and difficult. In a different society, it might not be so. It might be ordinary, trusted. But in our society, given our history, given the role that our history has assigned us, and the stereotypes that have evolved in that history that we are now subject to, that conversation is fraught. The African-American couple is going to be really worried that that teacher in that school not see their son in terms of those stereotypes about ability, stereotypes about aggressiveness. They're on the edge of their seat trying to make that not be the case, part of his experience in that school. The white teacher, for her part, she has, I think, an incredibly powerful form of stereotypes, right? She can worry that anything she might say, any kind of criticism she might offer out of a very constructive motivation might be taken as a sign that she's racist. The stereotype pressure that she's under there is that as a white American, she could be racist in this situation. And that's where that criticism could be coming from. So here we are with two parties with a great deal of pressure on them from our history as a society, stereotypes, bringing that history into our immediate experience and creating a situation in here's a diversity, two people interacting from different identities that I think causes a very fundamental problem we're not trusting, we're not paying enough attention to, which is that it's difficult to trust each other in this diverse situation. We're bringing onto the same setting people from groups that have had profoundly different experiences in society. I've been thinking about this in terms of the tension between remembering and forgetting. Both parties in this interaction have this sort of tension. Should I remember how my group is seen in society and continues to be seen in society and use that to interpret what's happening to me in this immediate situation? Or should I just forget that, completely trust the situation? I'm not under, what should I do? And both parties have this form of this challenge in this situation that is powerful psychologically, and that I think problematizes trust. And trust can be a very significant thing. I'm going to use an experiment that Jeffrey did and to illustrate this. he had co-authors who were of marginal significance in this, Lee Ross and I. It's really his story. Asking the question, how does a white professor give a critical feedback to a black student? And I thought it was a ridiculous question to ask, but he thought it was a good one, and so we pursued it. And I think it led to some of the more profound findings in our research program. We had Stanford students, white and black, write an essay about their favorite teacher that might be published in a new magazine we were going to have on teaching on campus. And then we asked them to come back 2 days later and get feedback on that essay. And our question was, would they trust this feedback? And we varied, of course, how we gave the feedback. And I think some of the more unsettling results, as I just noted, that we have are that the white students trusted the feedback on that essay, but the black students didn't. It's a much lower trust. And it was kind of expected, but still shocking that why wouldn't they trust this feedback? But if you take the perspective I've just sort of described, you can sort of see it. They don't know whether the feedback is coming from their work, their essay, or whether it's coming from how the feedback giver perceives their group's abilities. They just aren't quite sure about that. And they can't quite dismiss, they kept that remembering pressure is there. And that remembering pressure is reinforced in their lives by all kinds of things that Mary's going to talk about, cues in the situation, events that happen on television, make it very psychologically almost impossible not to remember and not to use that possibility in interpreting what happens to you. So they don't trust it. And then not trusting it, they're not as motivated to improve their essays by the feedback as they might otherwise be. And it's not just a single cross-sectional experience. It's a condition of life tied to that identity in this society, with this history, and with this family of stereotypes out there about us in our various roles. I think it's a powerful story about the social psychological experience that it can drive a great deal of what we might, if we don't understand that, attribute to much more internal kinds of things, lack of motivation, lack of abilities, all kinds of things would come into play. But when you understand the social psychological structure of the situation and how identity shapes that, it becomes clear that another aspect is important. Well, that's the dark part of the talk. The more positive part of the talk, I think, is that this offers us, if this is the culprit in diversity, if it's sort of a structured inability to trust and be comfortable, then maybe that's remediable in some more promising ways than if the whole story is tied to, and I'm going to overstate this, but if the whole story is tied to eradicating prejudice, which has really been the focus of our field as to what you need to do in order to improve intergroup relations. And I certainly, not for a second, want to be interpreted as diminishing the importance of that. That is hugely important, hugely important. But I want to argue there's maybe another avenue of remedy available to us. And it's an avenue that may be more accessible and more available to us to make progress on. And that is building trust. And the third condition in Jeff's experiment, I think illustrates that, because there was a condition in which the feedback was trusted by the African-American students mightily and was mightily motivating to them. In that condition, the experimenter says, look, we use really high standards in evaluating these essays because they might be published in this magazine. And so we're using high standards, but I've looked at your essay, and I think you can meet those standards. It's explosively motivating to the students. I mean, like 3 times more of them took the essays home to work on than participants in any of the other conditions in the experiment. It was a huge motivational input, trust, and then motivation to improve. That cuts through things that we think of as very hard to cut through. The feedback giver's got a different identity than these kids, but they trusted him just by the structure of that feedback, which has, I think, one big, fat, important signal in it, which is that I'm not saying stereotypically. I really believe in your promise in this situation. I'm not saying that I attribute to you the highest level of ability. I believe in your potential to meet this standard. That's a high standard. That's something that we can make a great deal of use of in our institutions. I've always kept that in mind over the years from that experiment, that you can take that to scale. I want to give you an example of its taking to scale. I want to point to a number of other things that I think are also tremendously important in building this kind of trust and that are available to us. I would say cues in the situation, and I think somebody in this session is going to talk about that a little later on, so I won't preempt any of that, but that's really powerful. Those are really powerful. We're having this huge debate about monuments. It's hard to trust a society that's going to have a monument to something that was really a travesty of the American experience. 400 years of 300 years of slavery, and you don't want to revere that and expect people to trust society in the face of that. I understand the complexities. I'm just raising the value here of controlling the cues in the environment and so on. Self-affirmation, I think somebody else may talk about that in this, is another strategy. Mindsets, belongingness cues are all things that I think serve this. But I want to, in this, just finish my remarks by giving you this example of how you take that condition that I just described, that Jeff is calling wise feedback, to scale. So at the University of Berkeley, Rudy Mendoza-Denton led a survey of the science departments at Berkeley, their graduate programs, with the question, are the women and minorities in those distinguished science departments, math, physics, astronomy, earth and planetary sciences, chemistry, computer sciences, electrical engineering, are the women and minorities in those programs doing as well as the men with regard to publication? The coin of the realm in graduate. Are you becoming a contributing scientist? How fast are you moving? Grades, as we all know, are of a marginal importance in graduate school. Publication is the coin of the realm. So what they found was that no, the women and minorities, what they feared was that no, women and minorities weren't doing as well in publication as were the men, except in the College of Chemistry. It's a college at Berkeley. And there the women and minorities were doing just as well as the men. And so then that's a bright spot. What is it that they're doing that makes it work? And I want to argue that the principle of what they do that makes it work is the same principle in that wise feedback experiment. They're basically treating the students with, I think, a kind of symphony of things. High standards, really high standards, direct conveying of the social capital needed to understand and succeed in a situation like that, a very clear pathway forward, and a lot of support in moving along that pathway. Nothing magical here, down on the ground. But I want to argue it's creating an environment that's trustworthy, that I can trust and I can relax in. I know where I stand. I know what this is about. I've been told. I've been helped. I've been supported, and in that kind of a context, which is available to us. It's not magical. I think it's more available to us than, dare I say, maybe eliminating implicit bias or something. This is available. We can all do this. And it creates an environment in which people can rise to forget about, they can drop that remembering issue and forget and engage unselfconsciously. Drop that sort of trust vigilance that is otherwise a necessity in that situation. What do the other science departments look like? Well, they look like they're mainly men, and men come in, they talk to the men, they don't pay that much attention to the women and minorities. It's just a little, just in an interpersonal dynamics, and pretty soon you've got really two classes of students in the situation. And I don't know if I don't need to elaborate on that. It happens without big intentions. I think it is the using of a paradigm of education that grew up in an era when the United States didn't have a commitment to an integrated, diverse society. And that was really trying to educate a relatively homogeneous set of students. And with a homogeneous set of students, maybe these same concerns wouldn't be there, because you're not bringing people into the situation from groups that have had such profoundly different experiences with society. They've had pretty much the same experience. So trust isn't so much of an issue there. And you can use a kind of laissez-faire, the talent will rise pedagogy that sort of dominates those fields in that kind of context. But when you're trying to diversify, you need to do this other thing. And that is what I think social psychologists can bring to the table to this big project of American integration. Just to add a little specificity, they bring students in 3 weeks early in the chemistry college, and they really tell them it's about publications. It's not about grades. Grades are fine, but it's about publication. You need to get involved right away. You're going to talk to 5 professors during this 3 weeks. They're going to each give you some ideas about how you might get started in research. We'd like you to pick one and have a proposal in by November 11th. I'm making that up. We'd like you to have the research done by March 3rd, and we'd like to have you a written paper by the end of the year. So look at all that's in there, and I'm gonna meet with you every week. And so it has a suite of ingredients that I think are wise in the sense of dealing with this more fundamental challenge of what I'm arguing is the fundamental challenge in diversity, which is that it's just hard for us to trust each other in these situations. The last thing I want to say is trust is a game that is played on the ground. It's available to everybody. You don't have to have the same identity as the student. My advisor did not have the same identity as me, but he treated me an awful lot like those chemistry faculty treated those students. And there are examples all over the place like this. I'm not that unique. I think it's something available to us. You don't have to have the same identity as the students. You don't have to match up perfectly. And I don't even think you need to have deep cultural knowledge of each other's background. I think you do need to be aware of each other's perspective in the situation and what their experience is like, how they're experiencing the situation. That I think, and that comes from asking people questions and putting yourself in an inquisitive a posture towards your student, respecting their perspectives and helping them and addressing them as they come up. I think it comes from that kind of a mindset as a mentor. But I don't think a lot of other stuff, because these situations can't sustain a lot of other stuff. But I do think it's simple enough that it invites all of us into this project of diversification. So we don't have to stand back, be threatened by it because of all these forms of stereotype threat that we're subject to in the situation. There is a way forward that invites all of us to participate. So with that, I'll stop. And we're going to have an interesting conversation at this point. I don't know who to turn to first, or maybe, Amy, do you want to direct the traffic at all here as to who we should turn to first?
No, thank you so much. I think Mary came off mute first, so I'll use that as Dr. Mary Murphy beginning our conversation between Dr. Murphy, Dr. Steele, and Dr. Jeff Cohen. Thank you.
Claude, I loved your remarks. I thought they were congratulations on this award from Jeff and me and SPSP and everybody else, all your students. I know we are so grateful for everything you've done for us. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I will start with saying, I'm really struck by this idea of, the need to be aware of others' contingencies, the need to be aware of what other people are dealing with in a context, in order to bridge that trust gap. And it seems to me that one of the things that's needed is sort of an affirmative interest in understanding, and almost like a spirit of curiosity, a humbleness to sort of be open that maybe my contingencies and concerns in a setting may not be the same as another person's contingencies and concerns, and to being open to understanding those, and seeing the world through other people's eyes. I think that that's one of the things that I was really struck by. Do you want to say anything more about that? I mean, do you think that that's one of the key things? What do the best instructors do, or what are the best people who bring people together do in order to create an environment that way?
Well, I think interpersonally, that's always a good, even outside of any challenge around diversity.
Intergroup.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just always good to start that way. I mean, at some point, having been in some leadership positions, you have to be clear and firm. There has to be that capacity too. But I do think before that, as much as possible, that really helps you be effective, is paying attention to the perspective, and is almost always surprising, I find. You're surprised about how other people are experiencing the same situation you are. We can be standing right next to each other, but be in completely different psychological spaces. And we're psychologists, so we can appreciate that, and knowing about it, take advantage of it. That it can help us be effective in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I was also struck by this idea of the shift from a colorblind ideology away from colorblind ideology to something else. And I've heard you speak before about this problem of locating prejudice in people. That when we say that, the real problem is this prejudiced person or that prejudiced person, then the solution becomes get rid of the prejudiced people in the context, right? And yet we know that because of the structures of the context, the cues in them, the policies that really support the way that the context works, bias and inequality is going to be reproduced. And so that we might need a different kind of ideology, beyond colorblindness and beyond sort of the prejudice in people model. I know I've written about like this idea of prejudice in places, that when the cues really signal that I'm not valued, I'm not respected here, I might not get a fair treatment here, right? That really can shape people's identity contingencies, their concerns, whether they trust the environment, those sorts of things. So what kind of model do you think would be useful to move to or towards instead of this color blindness? I mean,
yeah, I think colorblindness I try to give it its due. It's not avoidable, I think, in many ways, but it can blind us, and it's get rid of the blinding part of it, and to appreciate that people do have different experiences tied to their backgrounds, it also can be experienced by the disenfranchised as denial of their realities and insulting. And so that's another cost of it. So I think maybe the George Floyd moment has shaken the degree to which people are comfortable, using that as a standard of their morality in relation to race relations and group relations in general. And it's more. I wouldn't want it to lead to cancel culture. That what we need to do is to call out people who aren't colorblind. I think we don't want to, I'm not inviting in an atmosphere of great tolerance of prejudice. I don't want to say that, but I think it does load the situation, make it pretty hard for us to function. Just thinking about it social psychologically, it makes us hard. What really counts is I think, like the WISE feedback or the WISE chemistry program, helping people. That's what you trust. When somebody really helps me, I'm not sure I held my advisor to never having had a prejudicial thought. Could any of us? really passed that bar? I don't know. I'm not sure about that, but I trusted that he had my back and that he was helping me, and that I was learning a lot and going somewhere. That was enough. And with that there, some of the other features of the environment that otherwise could have been really upsetting weren't as upsetting because they didn't have the same significance. So I want to point to that fundamental mechanism at play in these relationships.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claude. Just to expand, if I could, on Mary's points and your talk, one of the things that struck me in your talk, and I took the liberty of inquiring with your former students about what they thought about you.
Do I want to be here to hear this?
And and one of the a couple of things came out. I guess there won't be time to go into all of them, but there were two things that came out, and I think it touches on a little bit on what Mary was saying and what came across in your talk. She's one of the things I really appreciate about your theoretical work is the message of optimism, and so that runs through a lot of your talk. In spite of these formidable cultural and historical forces, discrimination, the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery, it's possible to kind of carve out some room to maneuver in these encounters, sometimes with huge effects, sometimes, not always. So there's an optimism, and then there's also another theme that came up was empathy. So taking the actor's perspective, and it goes back to what Mary was talking about the importance of curiosity. Like if you assume everyone sees the situation as you do, if you really have this kind of colorblind mindset, it kind of cuts out curiosity. And so I think in a lot of your experiments and a lot of your research, that runs through as a theme in addition to optimism. It's just empathy, the actor's perspective. And so I'm just wondering if that was a kind of, can we take that? Can we take those values and incorporate them into a kind of working model of how to deal with diversity in a society based on empathy and optimism, a pragmatic optimism?
I certainly hope we can. I believe it, because I think I've gotten over the years to the point of almost thinking about the actor's perspective as a trick for having a different theoretical insight about something that has been long looked at in our field or in the social sciences more generally, because we take the observer's point of view, and we're looking at the people we're trying to explain. We put race or gender or something in the regression equation, and we then start explaining that variance in terms of things about those groups, and we miss the context of life that they're dealing with, and they never get into the explanatory structure of the situation. And I think just a trick strategy is to say, well, what world are those people dealing with? Suppose you were in their shoes. Suppose you were really poor or really rich. What would you be dealing with? And you get a different explanation. It's maybe not I'm not arguing either of them as absolutely definitive, but you get a different explanation that gives you some insight that maybe enables a problem to move forward, or our understanding of a problem to move forward. So I do think it's a reliable strategy, and it's been available to me just because I was in the field when these problems and had an identity and a set of experiences that made this an easy route for me to take in the intellectual work of the field.
And what are some so taking the actor's perspective, what's been helpful in taking the actor's perspective? Do you just imagine it? Do you, in developing, for instance, your research on stereotype threat, and then later with Mary on identity contingencies, are there methodologies to taking the actor's perspective that you could share?
Yeah, I go back to as early as being in graduate school, which was in prehistoric times. That's when you could get all the people in SPS in one living room.
Wow.
So it goes back a long way. But I felt I could divide up the field into the observer's perspective. Research that had the observer's perspective came out of that versus the actor's perspective. I like dissonance because dissonance was the actor's perspective. You know, what's it like to have this sort of internal dynamic going on? It was subjective. It seemed cool to me. It seemed like a novel, like a novelist would write. You know, you get inside the head of the. So it was sort of attractive. So I do think it's a very reliable and underappreciated phenomenon in the social science, and it's extremely important which perspective you take in understanding a problem, especially when you get into understanding real problems, poverty, low achievement, and you start using the observer's perspective. Then you could be standing at the doorstep of eugenics before you know it.
Yeah.
Which is what
I think this is
done. Taking the observer's perspective.
Yeah.
Takes the actor's perspective to say, genetics, what are you talking about? I'm dealing with this, I'm dealing with that. Try being poor for a while.
Yeah. I think this is one of the things that has always kind of frustrated me as Stereotype Threat got really popular and everyone and their sisters and brothers were doing Stereotype Threat studies, right? Many of which have now, entered the pantheon of classics. But as this idea got popularized, I think it also kind of got misunderstood, and people really started to think about it as in this observer way, such that people were saying like, well, what's wrong with women in STEM? What's wrong with these racial and ethnic minority students that they're so worried about stereotypes? Like, what's going on in their head that really focused on this intrapsychic problem of being worried about stereotypes? And that always bothered me, because I always saw even the original Steele and Aronson studies and the work with Steve Spencer, I always felt that stereotype threat was a situational and contextual phenomenon that you showed, I thought, elegantly through, what's the cue in the testing context? Is the test diagnostic or is it non-diagnostic? And that subtle situational cue shifted the experience of people in terms of having to worry about stereotype threat and their performance. And so I thought always from the beginning, stereotype threat showed the interpsychic nature of threat, how I think I'm going to be perceived by others, and the contextual and situational aspects of threat. And if it is situational and contextual, it means we can change those situations.
Yeah, that's where the optimism enters in.
Yeah, and so, I just really think that like, it's important to underscore that how important that observer and actor distinction is when thinking about what are the real challenges that we face when we think about a diverse society.
Yeah, when I want to feel sorry for myself, I think I remember it was just so hard getting people to not see it that way. It's just so hard. You would elaborately try to explain it, and then it would say, "Oh, well, you mean that they believe the stereotype," and then they fulfill it. You're talking about self-fulfillment, and that just went on forever. I think there is a broader appreciation of it now, but I don't know or understanding of it. I guess I don't know about appreciation. That may be going too far, but there's at least a broader understanding of that part of it. But I do, when I have taken in my dotage here several opportunities to make this point about the actor's perspective as the scientist taking the actor's perspective as what is missing. You can do a perfectly reliable, beautiful, methodological, beautifully statistically analyzed study that has been registered and replicated, and it can be completely wrong-headed because it doesn't originate from the right perspective toward the phenomenon. It's a real particular perspective. It's not that it's useless, but that it's missing a huge part of the phenomenon. So before the whole scientific apparatus is engaged, there is this question of perspective. And I think we can be aware of that.
My students, we published this study in 2015 where we asked people, putting people in the minds and experiences of, say, a woman taking a difficult math test, or racial and ethnic minority students having to check off their race or their gender before taking a test. And, these are white participants and mostly male participants. And what we found is that folks were able to say, okay, I think they're going to be concerned about being stereotyped. I think they might worry, they might experience a little anxiety, but did they think that that would actually result in lower performance? No, like they denied that concern, that contingency was actually going to result in more cognitive depletion, more, focus on disproving stereotypes. And so they underappreciated the downstream impacts. They thought, oh, these women, these people of color, they'll just push through, right? Yeah. And I think that that's really, it shows sort of that problem and how difficult it can be to take those perspectives in an intergroup kind of context.
I know one question Jeff was going to ask me was about what part of this do I feel has been ignored or underappreciated, or what I do over again or something like that. And I don't think we paid enough attention to white stereotype threat in this society. It's maybe not generalizable as far as Europe. That it might not be the same, but in American society, given our history, I think this is, for example, a moment of white stereotype threat after the George Floyd moment, not wanting to be seen as the cop in that horrible situation, not wanting to be seen as somebody that would endorse that or need that as a foundation of our society, and then maybe even whistling Vivaldi to deflect being seen that way, calling out my neighbor to deflect myself being. It's not coming, this tension, from their prejudice necessarily. It's coming from the fact that how you could be judged in this moment. It's raised the possibility of being seen a certain way to a level that's hard to personally avoid. And it creates a lot. I see it all around me. And a lot of the whistling Vivaldi here, I think, is very good, and I'm all for it. Reading books and understanding, and that's really, really good. So, but I do want to characterize it the right way. And if I had it to do over again, rather than focus the whole thrust of the theory on underperformance in education, I would have looked at it more in these dynamics, and thinking more about diversity per se has led me to think more about that side of the.
Yeah.
One of the things in what you say that that seems important is that even though at the surface level there might be a lot of differences between the white guy talking about race and the African American taking that standardized test, at this sort of deeper psychological level, there's some unity there in terms of what the experience is like in a situation of feeling like you could be judged for things outside of your control. And so the research on stereotype threat really kind of points to an underlying experience that I think a lot of people share, that we probably all have in common in one way or another, that feeling in a situation like, I don't know how other people are going to see me. I don't know if I'm going to belong here. And so that's kind of one of the kind of things about, I think a lot of the research you've done is that it points out these kind of underlying psychological unities that span across people from all different kinds of walks of life.
Yeah, well, I feel quite complimented by that characterization. I mean, I think that's one way of understanding somebody else's stereotype threat is to understand your own.
Yeah.
Put you in the actor's shoes, and you say, oh, so you mean the Black kids feel when they come into my class and I'm raving on about how ability is so, who's really smart, that they feel a version of what I feel if I had to go to the department diversity meeting and talk about implicit bias or something. There's a unity, as you say, to those two experiences. And so I can see that the reality of the other. If I just take the observer's perspective, it's hard for me to see your performance.
What's the same? Yeah.
And just say there's something wrong with you that you have that worry about that stereotype. Come on, get over it. Jump in. The water's fine.
Now,
That's right.
do you think I was just gonna ask some questions that people prime me with? So this will be some combination of the College Bowl study and This Is Your Life.
Uh-oh.
But do you think did that ability to take the actor's perspective, the optimism and empathy that run through a lot of your work, did that come from people that you read? Were there any kind of heroes in social psychology or psychology that, you know, when you started to read about research in the field as an undergrad or grad, you felt like this is, you know, it kind of changed your mind, changed the way you look at things?
That's an interesting question. I will say this is speculation. So like you're on the therapist's couch.
Yeah.
Speculate.
My back.
But I read a lot of novel. I was a novel addict, and I think when you read novels, especially Jewish novels, because they had that experience, and I thought, and this is really ridiculous for me to say in this forum, but I could sort of tell that sensibility in social psychology. Some social psychologists thought the rational thing to do is observe them and measure them, and some social psychologists thought the thing to do was to manipulate something and try to see if you could see a process actually in play. And I thought that second type was cool, I suppose.
Yeah.
It made me feel good. It brought the experience. It was an avenue to bringing my experience to light.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas the observer thing was, I don't know what that was about. I didn't like that kind of work. It's so I don't know where that particular set of inclinations comes from, but I do remember, probably from my own ambiguous identity and dealing with that set of issues and wanting that to be understood or visible or something like that. Probably comes from the current.
And so there were two
my own identity contingencies.
Yeah, so there were two things, like reading, kind of getting the actor's perspective, reading novels, but also that urge to manipulate and experiment. That was unique. That's kind of that's a sort of specific art form.
I love that about our field. I love that. I mean, it is art. It is art. I can talk about that, but because in any particular scientific situation, two different people would do two different things, and that's art.
It strikes me, I remember when I was just a first or second year grad student, and we were sitting there trying to think about what studies to put forward for a first year project or a second year project. And, you know, I think we had this conversation that with the phenomenon that we study, we don't have to turn on the phenomenon. The phenomenon exists, right? We have to figure out the ways to turn off the phenomenon. You know, and that, like, through experimentation, we can sort of see, you know, what are the right levers to pull to reduce identity threat, to make people feel identity safe, to make people trust the environment, right? And I think that also is a really interesting way that stereotype threat and identity focused work is different than much of the other parts of our field, where they're trying to get a phenomenon to occur. And we're trying to, in many ways, sort of the baseline situation is that phenomenon is activated, given structure, history, policies, practices, right, in the environment, stereotypes that, you know, are in the air. And so, you know, I've always been struck by that. And I think really inspired by your inspiration through experimentation. I just want to.
Well, you know, I'm so heartened to hear you say that, and it took some years to get to. I remember vividly where at one time social psychology was really hard for me. I did not have a very promising early career. I didn't know quite what to do. I could do the methods and I could do it all, but you know, it didn't. But then I read some people. I read Stanley Schachter, and I know maybe people have forgotten how significant that work was. That informing the field and showing what you could do with social psychological experimentation and how to think about what you were doing, and it clicked for me. But I was 10 years into the field by that. Then it got easier, and the actor's perspective and the experience of doing research got easier. I felt in it, as opposed to. So there was some shift for me coming after a good long dry spell of kind of scattered research. I could get things done. I did get tenure, which thank God that happened. But even then I realized I wasn't, but then all of a sudden everything, and then it got exciting, and so, you know, I love this field, its potential. I mean, I just think it's such an amazing intellectual enterprise. I know we're always in these throes of worrying about one thing or another and holding ourselves to one criterion or another. These are all important things to worry about. I don't want to avoid that in any way, but we don't want to forget that the core of the enterprise is this opportunity to reveal human psychological functioning, and that it has the potential to be so exciting, such an exciting endeavor. You feel very lucky to have gotten in this. I might have, if I was back as a teenager, I might have wanted to be a novelist.
Yeah.
But I'm happy I'm a social psychologist because the empirical part of it is thrilling.
Yeah, for people, so why social psychology? If one cared about making the world a better place and wanted to address issues of social justice, what's the case for academic research? How is it useful relative to other roles that a young person now could play in society? What would be your pitch for social psychology?
Well, my pitch would be it's fun, and it can lead to understandings that are not available, and that would really improve the functioning of those institutions. I mean, that's in some way I thought about it as an administrator, that I was fortunate to be a social psychologist, because I could bring a lot of understandings to decisions you have to make and to relationships you have to sustain and function in relation to. So I felt I had this whole big extra suitcase full of tools that my colleagues, that you didn't have. You had to rely more on administrative traditions and formula and other decision-making strategies. And I could learn those, but I had all this other stuff to bring to bear. I know people worry about that because it's a slow process.
Yeah, that's right.
I've had 3 ideas in my whole 50+ year career that wound up having any impact. And you could think that's pretty modest. It takes so long and you spend so much time fighting over the empirical integrity of what you've done and what you're doing. So it can seem to a newcomer like, wow, what a path to get on. I want to have an impact. And some people shouldn't do it. They should go try to have a more immediate political impact. I almost wanted to be a voter. I almost left graduate school to participate in voter registration. But if I'd left, I would have gotten drafted into the Vietnam War. So anyway, that's a confession. But I think that we can really help the world in the understandings we produce.
Can I ask you, Claude, you've had all these different roles in your career, your leadership roles, and you've been a faculty member, you've been a department chair, you've been a provost, you've been a dean, you've been an individual mentor to so many of us in the field. What do you see as the role of faculty and as leaders, as administrators in helping bridge these issues at educational level? What's the role of faculty? What's the role? I mean, all of us who are scholars and researchers, who are in the field working, we're either students and we're faculty members, but we're always mentoring others. And as leaders who have a lot of power in environments, what would you say the roles of those individuals are in this work?
Well, I think about your work on the behavior of faculty and how critical that is in helping faculty deal with the challenge of diversity that we're talking about here, that in this particular session we're focused on. And I mean, look how powerful that is. Now, I mean, does that mean that you publish that and then immediately all the faculty in the country say, okay, no.
I wish, no.
but it really is a big insight as to how faculty culture should change and what the scope of faculty responsibilities are in meeting the real challenges of our roles as faculty in a diverse society. That what would have worked in 1955 as a set of responsibilities for that role won't work now. You've got to get some other tools. That will take a while, of course, obviously, maybe a long while, but there'll be resistance, there are politics, tough out here. But it's a huge contribution to point in that direction. Without that, how would we know? Without that, we wouldn't know where to point. And we'd be arguing so that's what I feel the world needs us to do the kind of work that we do so that it will know how to handle certain situations.
Mm-hmm. Jeff?
Yeah, to build on that, given your different varied roles as researcher, as provost, if you could change anything, if you could wave a magic wand and change the way that colleges, universities work, from admissions to conducting their kind of day-to-day operations, what would you change to make the system fairer and more inclusive? Just given all the hats that you've worn.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I'm going to wing it, but I think what I sometimes have found myself thinking, it was really after World War II that we decided as a nation to implant science into our universities, as opposed to maybe Germany, where they're in institutes and the universities are for education more, teaching institutions more. We combine them and we rank ourselves really most fundamentally in the research enterprise. That's what gives a university its great distinction. The ones that are really, there are a lot of our universities that are good at both, especially if they have the resources to be good at both. But I guess I think that commitment to doing research, to making our universities research institutes too, sometimes has structured faculty responsibility in too far in that direction and too little in developing the skills needed to develop young people and to teach young people and to bring people into the society. And that set of things is where we're weak, I would say, from the purviews I've had. That's where we're institutionally weak in this society. There are a few places, there are many, but they're not many really, where you can go and get a really responsive faculty, have an experience that's that way. I think I went to a tiny college in Ohio, and I think I got some of that, and it made all of the difference. They weren't doing research. They were taking care of the students, bringing them in, doing the kind of things the chemistry department I talked about are doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the fact that we've structured ourselves institutionally around this one enterprise and not found a way to do to as much as we should do both things is weakness in our obviously highly distinguished.
That's interesting. So in a way, the faculty and the teachers are responding to a situation that's also been created for them.
Yeah, incentives, the incentives they're under. What do you got to do to get tenure?
Mhm.
How's it weighted? Do you have to? We're beginning to pay attention to that more. I see that more, but it's got a ways to go.
If I could, I know we're probably limited for time, but there was one burning question that I'm sure people would love to hear your perspective on, having been in this field now for 2 decades.
Careful. What number are you going to come up with? I started graduate school at 67. What is that? 54 years ago.
Okay, so that's helpful because you have a broad, long perspective on social psychology, and you've seen maybe, I don't know, half of its life unfold over your career. What would you say is your assessment of the field today, and what would you love to see happen with it?
Wow.
And
Well,
just kind of having that broad context, because you've seen so much.
I think we have too much, if I had to say anything, maybe too much physics envy. I'm not sure, and I'm speaking for myself, not for the field. I'm not sure I can say what is great for the field, but what we tend to get preoccupied with I would like to see us more preoccupied with the thinking and the intellectual life and enrichment that goes into picking good problems and interpreting data in rich ways. I'd like to see some of that background be more in the foreground, because you can spend an awful lot of time, years and years, decades, hashing over pretty meaningless methodological issues that really don't come to much. And so you got these really, really smart people focused on something that's distracting from a capacity of the field that's much greater than that, and looking for a level of perfection and so forth in areas that is really almost impossible to do. But our status and the like are tied to that mimicking of some image of the hardest science. That's what we are, a great science, but a hard science, I don't know. Human behavior is pretty hard to, anyway, I could go on and free associate to that. I think you get the gist of it.
Studying real world problems and phenomena seems like one thing you'd love to see.
Thinking deeply about them.
Thinking deeply about doing the work on this side of the research, the back side of the research that makes the research rich and really revealing and informative, as opposed to just jumping in and worrying immediately about reliability coefficients and the like. Whether you're going to use a Bayesian analysis or whether you're going to, these are important things. They're important things. You got to have these tools, but they're not all important, and they may drown out the education even that we need as social psychologists to do rich work. The reading outside of the field. I'll say when I went to Michigan, it was when in the sort of first third of my career, I moved from University of Washington to Michigan. And one of the things about Michigan at the time that knocked me out was social psych was in the Institute for Social Research, and all of a sudden you're talking to sociologists and economists and people were interested in your idea. So there was a lot of discourse about ideas and issues and understandings, and you got this perspective and that perspective, and you could spend a lot of time evolving an understanding of something. Then you really had to be held to absolute account at the methodological level, of course. But you had to do both. You had to chew gum at the same time. And I think it's easy to just identify with being a hard nose and leave it at that. And that's not a good.
Yeah, if you look back at the history of our field, when Kurt Lewin was doing a lot of his early research on like leadership style, and you look at some of those very classic studies, they're real kitchen sink manipulations in very kind of rough and tumble settings, and there's an urge to understand these really important social outcomes like scapegoating and prejudice, but he doesn't really quite exactly know what's going on. But over a kind of long process, the idea is through doing experimental research of the kind that you're talking about, where you're actually trying to manipulate leadership style and look at its effects, you can zero in on what leadership style means, what its implications are, and the process that work.
Yeah, no,
you may not have that in the first study or two.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say it took us maybe 5-6 years to have anything like an idea of stereotype threat. Just messing around, trying to understand underperformance, try this, try that. And I had the luxury of having another kind of program. I was sort of tapering out of self-affirmation stuff. And so I could produce a little something that would satisfy the department. But the main work was in going around like a gumshoe, trying to figure out what this underperformance was about. And Steve and I, and then Josh and I, kind of hashing around in the wilderness till then you actually get an experiment set up, and you don't know why you put these conditions in it, but now you got something that's, well, what does that mean? And then you can't publish that, but it's a clue to where you're going. By the time you publish it, you've got this. We submitted, we submitted 2 papers at once, one on race, one on gender, and they each had like 4 or 5 experiments in them. Just because by that time we knew how sternly this would be looked at. But it took so long to get there.
Yeah,
and it was fun. It was fun doing that.
But there's like a hindsight bias. It looks easier in retrospect, but the fact that it took you 5 years of gumshoe work to figure out how to do the studies.
Dick Nisbet was really involved in that, I have to say, and Dick gave me some sense of freedom. I remember going to lunch with him, and he said, "Well, you could do this." I was like, "Can I really do this? Because I got to be productive." And he was like, "Well, yeah, do it." I thought, well, if Dick Nisbet can tell me to do it, I could do it. And I looked around at Bob Zients. He would work his butt off on a problem and then forget about it and pick another problem. It was like a spirit of just intellectual engagement, and a lot of the work was all behind the experiments that ultimately got produced. So I think that was a rich period, and I know you love to read those old social psych books, and they are really rich, beautiful books. Goffman, there's a lot of thought there. Yeah, that's the part of the field that we need to. Here I sound like an old man. Back in my day, we used to walk to school, but.
Sounds like go deep and don't lose faith when things take a while.
Yeah.
It does open up this topic of the social psychology of the social psychologist.
Yeah.
Because the incentives of the field, the situation of being a professional social psychologist may or may not incentivize that kind of work over the long. And we could be asking ourselves as a field, well, how do we want to change the situation of our field?
Bob Zients got tenure with 3 publications. Leon Festinger got tenure with 1 or 2.
Yeah.
Times have changed.
I got tenure with maybe 6 or 7 scattered publications. Some in alcohol, some in, I didn't know quite what to do. But now it's a much more competitive. That really is talking about having walked to school, but it did, but giving ourselves a little more time and relaxing those incentives so we can think and enjoy and talk to each other and develop ideas is that I definitely think we could do more of.
Well, this has been tremendous. And I guess in conclusion, I was hoping very briefly, Claude, we've talked for a little bit about what people in power and leadership can do for our field. And I was wondering very briefly if you might conclude today's session by saying some words to the young people in our audience, the students and the junior scholars who are going to be the ones carrying our field forward after everyone in this conversation has retired. What do you have to say to them today?
Well, I always do say that I believe, social psychology among the sciences has a great piece of real estate, that this is a great level of analysis, set of phenomenon with which we get to work on. It's sort of closest to the science of almost everyday life and social experience, which is so poorly understood. There's so much of the future ahead in terms of things to understand and discover about our social psychological functioning as human beings. I don't, as much as we can criticize ourselves and have doubts, trade on doubts, people turn to this field and are interested in what we have to say. So I really think we have an important part of what scientific real estate, or just an important role in society, maybe another way to put it. So take the best of the concerns seriously, but don't let that deter you from thinking and enjoying the experience of discovery and expression, because it's a great contribution to, it's a position that can have a very, a kind of contribution that resonates broadly in society, and it's a unique privilege to be in that kind of situation where what you do can resonate very broadly, can be broadly useful in society. So I think those things are things to reify and hold on to as we worry about this or that.
Well, thank you so much again for making the time to speak to us today. And Mary, Jeff, thank you so much for being part of our panel as well. And thank you to everyone who's watching this.